All set? All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Bladow, and I'm a grad student in the English program here at NMU. I wanted to start by expressing my thanks to everyone who has helped make this summit possible. Chimagwich to everyone at the Center for Native American Studies for sponsoring and organizing the event, especially Amy Cree-Dunn, who led our planning committee. Miigwech also to the presenters who have come to share their knowledge and experiences, and to you all for attending. I hope that today's panels and workshops call each one of us into positive action and inspire those who are already involved to continue pursuing social and environmental justice in their communities. So I'm graduating this May with a master's degree in literature and creative writing, and so I spent a lot of this year working on my thesis. And when I first started trying to figure out what kind of topic I wanted to do, I decided I really needed to pare down my interests and see where I could make connections between them. And sustainability has been one topic that I spent a lot of my time thinking about, so I wanted to make sure if I'm going to spend all this mental energy thinking about sustainability, I really should try to rein it into my thesis. So when we think of sustainability today, many times we're reminded to go local. We hear about the benefits of patronizing local businesses, which enriches our own communities. We also hear about developing local food systems. And by turning away from overly packaged and processed foods and away from produce that has been shipped thousands of miles, we do wonders for our own health and for that of the environment. So instead of heading to the supermarket, many are returning to farmers markets and learning how to grow their own food. In the process, people who have had little, if any, previous connection to the land in which they learn to appreciate, learn to appreciate its natural cycles. At the same time, we increase the security of our communities by strengthening local food networks instead of relying on fragile supply chains stretched across the globe. So if you couldn't tell, food was also one of my interests. And so I've got food, I've got sustainability. How do I bring that to my literary studies? So I took the idea of going local, had that in mind, and I picked up Dwellers in the Land by Kirkpatrick Sale. And this is one of the first books to discuss the concept of bioregionalism, which the basic idea behind bioregionalism is that rather than organizing our society around pretty much arbitrary sort of artificial boundaries, he suggested that we really structure them around natural geographies, ecosystems, watersheds, and bring our scale of attention to those sort of boundaries. And so by scaling ourselves down to bioregions and learning to depend on those specific regions, he thought we would be more sustainable. And one part of Sale's argument that I was really struck by was where he says that an important component of living in a bioregion is to learn its lore. He writes, "Every place has a history, a record of how both the human and natural possibilities of the region have been explored, and this must be studied with new eyes." He goes on to say, "And though not every place has kept its history properly alive, a fountain of information still exists if we but tap it." So suddenly I had an idea. While Sale is mostly concerned with this bioregional lore being stories from the past and of how the land was lived in and inhabited, I thought it could also be useful to look at contemporary fiction. So how do current authors portray landscapes in their histories, and how do these portrayals influence our own perceptions of those landscapes? These are the sort of questions addressed by bioregional literary criticism. Analyzing the literature of one particular place, scholars can identify trends and map out sort of an ecosystem of stories that grow there. This is important to do because the stories we tell ourselves about where we live greatly affect how we interact with these places. And one kind of common example I hear of that is the idea of, well, we tell ourselves a plant is a weed, and because of that, then we have all these management ideas behind it. But it starts with that naming and that decision that this plant is a weed and this plant is not. So that sort of thought going on there. I chose the southern shoreline of Lake Superior for my focus. I found 4 different novels situated within this bioregion. 2 of these were set on Madeleine Island, which is right around here. The Birchbark House and The Game of Silence by Louise Erdrich. Set in the mid-1800s, these books were the first in a children's series about an Anishinaabe girl named Omakayas and her family, who must face the pressures of expanding white culture. The stories take place on Moningwanekining, which means the island of the golden-breasted woodpecker, or today Madeleine Island, which is located in the Chequamegon Bay area of northern Wisconsin. Reading the books, I was happy to discover that food is also on Erdrich's mind. The predominant action within both novels is the procurement of food. The characters spend most of their time harvesting plants and hunting animals. These primary activities emphasize the materiality of local existence, showing where and how resources become food. Furthermore, the birchbark house is structured around the seasons, and many times a season is identified by the harvest or occupation that occurs within it. The opening line of one section reads, "It was a cool, dark summer night and the first days of blueberry picking time." And another reads, "Now it was time to harvest the wild rice that grew across from the island." So these statements demonstrate added significance to time and season on Moningwanekining, rather than saying, oh, it was just a cool, dark summer night, or it was a time in spring. It always ties back to what the predominant activity is for that season. So these statements, sorry, I said that. The necessity of gathering food from the island ensures careful attentiveness to it. Marrying cultural practices to the land ensures that ritual and custom involve natural cycles. Therefore, as the adolescent Omakayas learns about the cultural roles and expectations placed upon her, she simultaneously gains ecological knowledge. In one scene, her family travels to ricing camps to harvest manuman, or wild rice. Omakayas and her cousin Two Strike decide to sneak out in a canoe to gather manuman early in hopes of winning the praise of their relatives. But when they return from the endeavor with a full canoe, her father Mikwam scolds them. He explains that they did not wait for the elders' approval to begin the harvest. And he says, "You struck the manuman too green in your boat," he said abruptly, "ruining the plants. My daughter, there's a way we do things. We do it to take care of the rice. We listen to the old people, they who check the rice and watch for the exact right moment for us to humbly accept the gift. You went against the way things are supposed to go. You didn't listen to your old ones, your own grandmother among them." So the speech underscores the profound respect the family has for their homeland, and it emphasizes the need for balance in order to maintain a healthy ecosystem. Mikwam relies on those who have had the most experience with the land, his elders, to say when it is right to harvest. This episode teaches Omakayas about how cultural traditions promote the well-being of both her community and the plant on which they depend. Those who currently rely on the foods of their bioregions share this awareness, including Native Americans who follow traditional gathering cycles. In an article on traditional ecological knowledge, Winona LaDuke writes, "To be secure that one will be able to harvest enough involves more than skill. It also involves careful observation of the ecosystem and careful behavior determined by social values and cultural practices." So in that statement, LaDuke expresses the interweaving of culture and landscape to produce acute awareness of one's environment. Careful observation ensures ecological preservation as much as it does human preservation through nourishing harvests. Erdrich maintains the primacy of land in the game of silence when she describes Nokomis's garden. Nokomis received the garden from her mother, who had inherited it from hers. The earth had grown rich from generations of careful replenishment. It's a line from the book. That the family's legacy in here is not in a house or not in any object, but in the soil, reinforces the fundamental link between heritage and land resources. The fertility of the garden is testament to the history of the family that tends it. Memories of the ancestors thrive there, contributing to a sense of home more profound than the cabin or the wigwam, the birchbark house, the two different residences that the family transitions between throughout the year. So Omakayas feels that if she were ever forced to leave the land, this quote, "Her heart might fall right out of her body to lie forever on the ground it loved." The ground, not the house or any other place, but the ground itself. The wild rice harvest and Nokomis's garden both suggest that removal from the particular landscape of Moningwanekining would disrupt well-established cultural traditions. Both novels continually emphasize the necessity of local foods and harvests, ensuring that fundamental importance of food is not ignored by readers. Though not known for being agriculturally amenable, the South Superior bioregion does provide a number of foods often overlooked by the majority of its current inhabitants. So we've got a lot of different things. Traditional diets in the birchbark house include some 24 different plants and animals, including berries, maple sugar, wild rice, roots, nuts, fish, and a variety of game. This is just a list of, I tried to make an index of all the different foods that were mentioned, and this is what I came up with from the Birch Bark House. Despite this variety, there's not always enough. Historical accounts frequently note the hardships of subsistence. For instance, Ruth Landis writes in The Ojibwe Woman, a record of an Ojibwe community in Western Ontario, "At all times, but especially during the winter, life is an unending struggle to satisfy the elementary wants. The need for food drives hunters insistently." Erdrich portrays a similar situation in the South Superior bioregion by refusing to present the landscape through a pastoral lens of plenty. Instead, hunger and fear of scarcity ensure a sense of realism about traditional food systems in the region. The dominance of food in the characters' lives, such as the way the harvests mark the seasons, determines their worldviews. As a result, the novel's themes often revolve around food and notions of satiety and hunger. One of these themes is community. Erdrich frequently unites food with communal gatherings. In her 2003 nonfiction narrative, Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country, she writes, "It seems to me that Ojibwe people always eat with happy grace. Food is part of every gathering and ceremony." She portrays this sentiment in the Birch Bark House, where harvests reinforce individual and communal identity by gathering individuals together to partake in the work as well as its rewards. As food cements communal unity, it also reinforces individual relationships. Gifts of food demonstrate affection, as when Omakeas gathers berries for her sister Angeline, or when her mother Yellow Kettle creates a fish soup for a cousin. The character Old Tallow gives maple sugar to Omakeas and shares the animals she hunts with the family. Quote, "They would sometimes wake to find a haunch of venison just inside the door, or bear meat, a fish or two." Furthermore, instances of eating in the novel are almost always communal. The few exceptions to this depiction tend to cause discomfort or disapproval. One such exception is Omakeas' savoring of the maple sugar given to her by Old Tallow. Omakeas' first thought on its consumption reads, "There was no way to share such a tough nut of sweetness. How would she divide it?" Before anything else, she wonders about how to share it. Pondering this on her walk home from Old Tallow's, she finds a patch of strawberries and plans to return to the spot with her sister to enjoy them. Omakeas' little brother Pinch provides some of the first instances of hunger in the novel. Her scorn at his big appetite and greedy behavior are initially comical, whereas later in the novel, the threat of starvation transforms hunger into a frightening experience. The first time that Pinch is mentioned, Omakeas admits to not liking him. And the narration reads, "She thought there was something wrong with him, so greedy, so loud. He yelled at Omakeas if she was slow in giving up her willow doll, her little rock people, or anything else for that matter, including food." So Pinch's demands for the food show his greed. In a culture where food is something that is always shared, he shouldn't need to demand it. Pinch's greed becomes a serious issue in chapter 6. His actions in this chapter are another exception to the trend of communal eating, and they are met with disapproval. His mother, Yellow Kettle, asks him to watch over some choke cherries she has lain out to dry while she goes to check on fishing nets. She tells him, "This is our winter seasoning and food. You'll be glad of them when we are hungry in the little spirit moon." And her concern reflects the preemptive motive behind harvesting. While the food may be delicious or serve as a pleasant reminder of the flavors of summer once the seasons have turned, the primary reason Yellow Kettle gathered them is to mitigate the hunger she expects them to experience. Other characters have presumably experienced scarce winters besides Yellow Kettle. Nokomis, the eldest in Omakeas' family, has also experienced many such winters, and continually reassures her relatives with the wisdom and guidance she provides. This reassurance often connects to the food traditions that she follows faithfully. Nokomis shows reverence each time she gathers food or plants for medicines. For example, when she plants seeds in her garden, she, quote, "blesses them gently," end quote. Her keen awareness of her dependence on local foods make their propagation and preservation sacred tasks. One of the clearest instances of this is her presiding over the storage of the family's food cache for winter. After the food is packed away, meat, fish, corn, rice, maple syrup, and the few choke cherries not eaten by Pinch, Nokomis blesses the cache, beseeching the Creator to see them through the winter. And she says, "We're very small, just human. Help us live this winter through. Come to us, especially during the harshest moon, the crust on the snow moon, when so often meat is scarce, when the ice is too thick to catch many fish, when disease breaks us and the Wendigo spirit, the hungry one, comes stalking from house to Anishinaabe house. Take a drink really quick. Give you a break. All right. Erdrich sets the birch bark house during a period when increased contact with Anglo-Europeans and Anglo-Americans was beginning to pressure indigenous populations into relocating. And this was a slide, an image I found from, it says right here, La Pointe circa 1840. The above cut is from a picture belonging to Miss Harriet Wheeler. An inscription on the back reads as follows: asked her for a company quarters at Madeleine Island in 1834. So according to the Ojibwa Curriculum Committee, the years between 1836 and 1867 were a time of great change and sorrow for most of the Ojibwa people. Pressure upon them increased from all sides, and within this third of a century, the white man took possessions of the core of the Anishinaabe land. So it's important to note as we're thinking about food systems, also the particular time when these books are taking place, time of transitioning food systems and learning to taking in new foods from the traders, and learning with the agreements that were signed. I don't know how many people are familiar with Sandy Lake and the incidents at Sandy Lake, going there and then expecting to be paid in food and other goods, and then not getting any, or getting substandard food, and how that ties into these ideas of starvation and hunger in the novels. Anyway, the situation of this expansionism becomes a key component in the plot of the novel and its sequel. In one scene, Omakayas and her sister Angeline hide in a bush to eavesdrop on Miquim and his companions. The men's conversation turns to discussion of the Chimukamanag, the encroaching white settlers. Miquim's friend Fishtail remarks that the Chimukamanag will not be satisfied until they have all of their wild rice beds, hunting grounds, fishing streams, and gardens. Significantly, each place Fishtail mentions provides food. Land is valuable because of the nourishment it provides. This list contrasts with a similar one a few pages before, where the narration explains that the Chimukamanag were white people, quote, traveling in larger numbers than ever to Ojibwa land and settling down their cabins, forts, barns, gardens, pastures, fences, fur trading posts, churches, and mission schools. Here, only 3 of the 9 terms, barns, gardens, and pastures, suggest food procurement. The rest relate to other social institutions, such as domestic, military, commercial, educational, or spiritual. Each institution is symbolized by a building that rests on the land, rather than a feature of the landscape, like the streams, grounds, and beds in Fishtail's list. The Chimukaman need is for space itself more than the potential nourishment those spaces provide. And Fishtail goes on to say, not even when we are gone and they have the bones of our loved ones, will they be pleased. He draws an analogy to physical hunger to describe the settler's desire for land. When the Ojibwa characters speak of the Chimukaman desire for land as hunger, it suggests the fierce intensity of white expansionism. In his culminating remarks during the conversation, Fishtail says, before they were born, before they came into this world, the Chimukaman must have starved as ghosts. They are infinitely hungry. Living through harsh winters in a landscape where food is not guaranteed and where harvests determine nearly all aspects of life, Fishtail makes an especially stark statement by qualifying Chimukamanag hunger as infinite. The characters already comprehend great hunger. To figure it as endless further intensifies his words. The Chimukaman appetite for land seems especially insatiable when characters who persistently face hunger imagine even greater desperation. In her acknowledgments to the Birch Bark House, Erdrich remarks that when readers speak Omakayas' name aloud, they will be, quote, honoring the life of an Ojibwa girl who lived long ago, end quote. An even greater honor would be to adopt and adapt some of the traditional food knowledge that this girl knew about her land. As a bioregional text, the novel encourages modern readers to think of their own food cultures. For those who live in the same region of the upper Midwest, it demonstrates that the supermarket need not be the only place to obtain nourishment. A variety of foods are available in the local landscape. Revitalizing sustainable harvests of these foods would also promote the biodiversity of this region, a place where, according to ethnobiologist Gary Nabhan, at least 32 traditional foods are now at risk. Attuned to local resources as well as their seasonal availability, inhabitants would be better equipped to perceive the environmental threats looming over their own bioregion and to become committed to changing them. Such respect for and commitment to the land, inhabited by Omakaas's historical and fictional, by current tribes and other peoples, would ensure an even more profound honor is bestowed upon those who have lived on it before. And I think there's also great promise in these books being children's literature. I hope that teachers in the area will utilize them, as they seem to have so much potential to teach by focusing on Anishinaabe history and culture, and also on food. I envision activities that help young students develop deeper understandings of where food comes from and the work it takes to produce it. I hope such activities would enable students to see their landscape as a valuable food resource worth knowing about and caring for. And I probably should have mentioned earlier, a lot of these, the images were taken on a trip on Madeleine Island, on a trip I took in February, and this was the schoolhouse at La Pointe. So I was peeking in the window because you couldn't, it was closed up, but I still got a shot. So. In her memoir, Louise Erdrich muses on those who resided beside Lake of the Woods, Minnesota. She writes, "At one time, everyone who lived near the lake was essentially made of the lake. As the people lived off fish, animals, the lake's water, and water plants for medicine, they were literally cell by cell composed of the lake and the lake's islands. Similarly, the characters in the Birchbark House in the Game of Silence were composed of the foods they found in their home along the southern shore of Lake Superior. Considered in this way, food is one of the greatest links to our environment. It's the part of the natural world that we take into ourselves in order to continue to exist, in addition to air and water, of course. Learning about traditional food systems from Erdrich's novels and from traditional ecological knowledge greatly benefits contemporary sustainable agricultural movements. Perhaps we'll again find the majority of ourselves composed primarily of the foods of our bioregions and benefiting from the stories and novels that are set in our homelands." Miigwech. Does anyone have any questions? Mm-hmm. Right. It's especially problematic when I'm trying to, merge it into real world, take fiction and try to say something about the way people are, the way people should be, and when it involves such a heavily historical component. I think from the research that I did in looking up these books, I think Louise Erdrich has done a pretty fair job of looking at a lot of historical sources and texts, and I don't know, right. Right. Yeah. Right. I think just making sure that you're aware that this is literature and it's not history, and that there's separate things. It's just another voice, and doing your own research outside of it is important. I don't know if that helps at all. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Okay, our next presenter is Phil Belfi, Taking the Academic Out of the Academy by Taking It to the Tribes, a presentation on how lessons from the tribes can help restructure our lives to bring awareness and solutions to our global environmental crises. Please welcome Phil.
It's going to take me a second to get this set up probably. Okay, got it set up. Ani, filmen universitetskas. Kababakanagad, Amistad da. Ajijak and do dem. I am Phil Belfie. I'm a White Earth Ojibwe person. I teach at Michigan State University right now, and this title of this presentation is pretty much my motto these days. I'm very happy to come to conferences like this, and we'll get into this. I'll show you some of the ones that I've been organizing. One thing that I really hate is a bunch of academic PhDs yakking at each other. It's just so boring and meaningless. What we have been trying to do is through the Center for the Study of Indigenous Border Issues, trying to bring more voices into this discussion that we're having. One of the things that I will admit we've been a total failure on, and I think this conference might be about the same, getting federal government or state government people to come to these things is virtually impossible. This center has organized 4 conferences so far. The first one was at University of Western Ontario. We had community people, NGO types, independent researchers, and of course the academics, no government types. The second one we organized was at, let's make sure I get this right, Walpole Island. Again, exactly the same thing. It was held on the First Nation Reserve at Walpole, but we couldn't get any government types to come. The third one, I organized at Michigan State University on Earth Day, 2007. And I think there was one state official there, not positive because he didn't make a presentation, which I was hoping to do. But I think there may have been one person there whose job kind of required him to be there from the state. The center is a kind of an ad hoc organization. It's not an official organization at Michigan State or anywhere else. The other 2 co-directors are David McNabb, he's at York University in Toronto, he's Métis, and Carl Heel, who's a Garden River member, and he's at the University of Western Ontario. Another thing that I've been working with is the traditional knowledge revival pathways people. I believe it's in your program on the last page. You got a bunch of links there. And Amy and her mother were at my conference, and Victor Stephenson, who was the person who organized this from Australia, was there, and I believe he came to this conference last year, is that right? And just as an example of what the difficulties we face in academia, last year, well, 2 years ago, we had Victor come to our conference. Very highly respected, well received, everything is going great. We thought we'd bring him back, and he brought 4 of his compatriots, had 5 people. They spent 1 month in both Michigan and Ontario, going to tribal communities and various university settings, etc. And our provost would not give me 1 dime for this effort, and absolutely no future support whatsoever. None. 0. These are the kinds of problems we face. And that's why I like to take it out of the academic and take it someplace else. I have to update this. Our call for papers on the new Indigenous Policy Journal is actually on the 8th of April is the deadline. And with that issue, we are going to become peer-reviewed, and I'm going to be the editor of that journal. And again, talking about the academic, I'm approaching my chair for some release time, but of course we got all kinds of budget problems, so I'm never going to get it, I'm sure. She said, I'll have an answer for you soon. But I encourage everybody who is here and people who aren't here, the students, etc., send me your papers. We will send them out for peer review, and we will, if they're germane, we will definitely publish them. And our major focus in this journal is to take it out of the academy. We have lots of people. I've been involved with it for 5 years. I've been the web editor. So if you go to that website there, you'll see my efforts into it. And we definitely want more and more community people and more non-academic people to contribute to our journal, which is our only function, so to speak. Also, I've been in discussion with people at Michigan Indian Press. It's owned by the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. I want to become their editor, and they're willing to have me become their editor for the press, but again, there's all kinds of budget problems. And my university told me flat out, they will not give me release time to do that work. Just won't do it. And so if there's going to be any kind of that effort, it has to come from the tribe. And of course, just like everybody else these days, they're hurting for money. They've laid off a lot of people. And some of the people I had been working with at the tribe are no longer there. So that's why the word pending is up there. Because it's, I'm afraid it's probably not real positive. Also, I've been working with the people at Shingwak Kinamagagamik, which is in Sault, Ontario. But it also has a very international focus. One of the things that I'm very much concerned about is ignoring the border between U.S. and Canada. And the people at Shingwak are very much involved in that same ideology and that same thinking. Shingwak was one of the older chiefs. He signed the 1820 treaty at Sault Ste. Marie, the first major treaty in the land cessions in the Upper Great Lakes. And he signed it under his English name because he was so upset about the whole process of the people coming up into that territory to assert their authority and their dominance, of course. But one of the things that he became very, very interested in is setting up a school to teach Native students both sides of this problem, how to survive in the visitor culture, and also to learn their own traditional ways. And that's what the Shingwak is trying to do. They're physically established at the old Shingwak boarding school, which is now Algoma University in Sault, Ontario. So it's a really, really strange thing. It was the boarding school. When they shut it down in this, I think it was about 1970 or so, the province took it over, started Algoma University College at that time. And people at Shingwak have to go back to the people at Algoma to get permission to use their own buildings. It's really a strange situation. And I've been trying to work through with them to do some teaching up there. And there's all kinds of problems we got to deal with in that regard too. But anyway, things that I'm trying to do, trying to take what I learned from Michigan State, my degrees, et cetera, and bringing them back to the people there. I'm also working with the Anishinaabe Joint Commission. And what happened there, again, it's a cross-border thing at Sault Ste. Marie. The Sault, Ontario sewage plant was undergoing renovation, or upgrading, I guess they call it. And in the process, they were dumping raw sewage into the St. Mary's River. It wasn't affecting the river on the north side of the border, but on the south side at Sugar Island, that's where all the turds were floating. And so the people there got all upset about it, obviously. And then there was this big problem. Well, the Canadians look, our shore is fine, there's no problem here. We don't know where those turds are coming from. They're not coming out of our plant. And then the Michigan people are saying, well, yeah, they are. They're here. There's no jurisdiction. Nobody would take jurisdiction because it was an international issue. So what the Native people did, there's two tribes on the U.S. side, two tribes on the Canadian side, and they formed this Anishinaabe Joint Commission, and they asserted jurisdiction over that waterway. And they said, we don't have to worry about whether it's U.S. or Canada. This is our territory, Bawating. And so they went over there, literally with video cameras at the outflow, and got video of raw sewage floating out of that sewage treatment plant. And they did manage to get, I think it was last summer, maybe the summer before as well, got some money from both governments to do the surveying and the study. Again, it's a jurisdictional thing. The Canadians say, well, we can't go over to your side of the river, and the Americans say, well, we can't go on your side of the river, but the Anishinaabe obviously don't recognize that border, so that's one other place that we're trying to work with those kinds of issues. And what we did is they signed this treaty vowing that they will maintain and restore that watershed, all four tribes, without regard for that river. And I've been working with them on a lot of these environmental issues as well. This is the last conference that the Center for the Study of Indigenous Border Issues sponsored. It was last August at the Sioux Tribe Reservation, but it's also held at Garden River Reservation. We did both sides. And in the process, we had this border, I have the word in quotes, of course, because we don't recognize the border. This border crossing from the Sugar Island, which is what you see in the background. I'm standing on the shore at Garden River Reserve taking these pictures here. And it was very, very interesting because there were border guards out there. They all had their video cameras taking video of all the people, both in the boats and the canoes and those of us on the shore. But they didn't bother that crossing. The Americans, crazy as they are, were going to try to arrest these people because they were leaving from an unauthorized port. And so the one guy, the chief at Batchewana, Dean Sayer, said, "Oh, please, 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 please arrest us. Please do. Because that will guarantee our right by law." So they finally said, "Well, okay, let's not do that." Because nobody wants to go to court over these issues, obviously. But I've been working with, obviously, with all these people in this area, trying again to get the academic out of the academy back to the people where it belongs, working with students and community people, and getting zero support from my university. Zero. One of my chairs, the previous chair, when I was coming up and doing work, this is before with Cora. I think even back when it was not even Cora, but anyway, that's like Glyphwick, only it works in the eastern end in northern Michigan. He said, "Well, have you got any grants to do that work, Phil?" And I said, "No, I just go up there and help these people out. They asked me to, and so I'm willing to do it." He said, "Well, if you don't have any grants, then there's nothing you can't even put it in your annual report. Nothing." But I still do it because I was asked, number one, and number two, I'm happy to. So there's my email if anybody has any questions. I know we're really pressed for time. I could talk for hours on these things, but the issue that I always deal with, and it's two, but it's really one. It is sovereignty and sustainability. You can't have one without the other. So everything I do works in that area. Obviously, that border issue stuff is the sovereignty thing, but it also is the sustainability. If we don't have sustainable lands that we live on, then we don't have sovereignty. They go together. So, Chimigwich, Nigijita. Okay.
Could you speak a little bit about how the Homeland Security Act has impacted the Jay Treaty?
That's an interesting point. I went to a conference, I'm trying to think when it was, maybe about a month or so ago in Sarnia, at the Sarnia Reserve in Ontario. And it was co-sponsored by the Assembly of First Nations, which we don't have the similar type of thing in the U.S., and the INAC, which is their BIA, Indian and Northern Affairs. And it was all about that issue. And again, it's a question of sovereignty. The United States government has a sovereignty issue that we must have our passports, et cetera, to cross that border. And the way it is today, people who live in the Sioux area, if they go into the U.S., they ask their citizenship and they say, "I'm a North American Indian." And that seems to be sufficient. But now, with the new rules, that's not sufficient anymore. You have to have a secure certificate, swipeable types of certificates. So we still have that right to cross the border on the Jay Treaty, but it's a question of sovereignty. You know, how deeply are they going to impose their sovereign right to demand certain papers from you? And as long as you have the right papers there, we'll let you in. There's no question about it. But it's a question of coming up with those papers. I have a passport, so it doesn't affect me. But people in Canada, who live in Canada, what they're doing in that conference in Sarnia was all about the Canadian government is issuing these cards that are going to be, they're called Secure Certificate of Indian Status. And it's going to be swipeable and all that stuff. But the people are very concerned about it because it has that Canadian flag at the top. It says, we are not Canadian citizens. We're North American Indians. And there was just one more thing, and we can move on. In that particular legislation that's creating this card so that the U.S. government will be happy with it, let's say you're an elder, you don't have a birth certificate. Well, you can get somebody to be your guarantor that you are who you say you are. And so there's a big, long list of who can be a guarantor, including your tribal chairman or your tribal counselor. And then at the very top of that list, it says, in order to be a guarantor, you must be over the age of 18, you must be a Canadian citizen, and you must have known this person for X number of years. So this one First Nations council member says, hey, I can't be a guarantor. I'm not a Canadian citizen. I'm Anishinaabe. So it doesn't fit. You can put all the things, definitions under it you want. It says I got to be a Canadian citizen, but I'm not. So they still have a lot of issues that they have to deal with there. And people are very, very concerned, especially border communities, obviously, with that card infringing on their sovereign rights as First Nations people, and also their sovereign right to cross that border without interference from the feds. There doesn't seem to be any problem coming into Canada. It's just the U.S. People are crazy, quite frankly. Okay. I'll make this.
Okay. Our next presenter is Agnes Pawlowska, and her presentation is using the global to support the local community development at Poplar River and the proposed UNESCO World Heritage Site in northern Manitoba. And her presentation examines the Manitoba Poplar River Anishinaabe development plans for an ecologically sustainable community. Please welcome Agnes. Thank you.
And sorry, my presentation disappeared. My presentation disappeared. Before I say anything, I guess because my presentation actually is going to touch up on a lot of things that have been said today. So I guess this is just a continuation of everything, especially the hydro development or the damming of the rivers. And another thing I have to say is even though it is international, I guess, issue here because a lot of people are from the States, but this is a Canadian issue. The problems, I assume, are very similar, especially in terms of First Nations and the government relations. And just some of the things that I can say about terminology is we don't say American Indian or Indian. We consider that in Canada to be politically incorrect or a colonial term, so we actually don't use it. So I will be referring to things such as First Nations or Aboriginal or Indigenous or Native, because that is how what we actually use. So the title of my presentation is Using the Global to Support the Local, and it is a community development at Poplar River, and an initiative which I find to be quite new and precedent-setting actually in Canada for First Nations in the Boreal Forest or any other First Nation in Canada, mainly because it is a preventative move on the part of a First Nation rather than, I guess, a problem dealing with issue as we have seen earlier today, and I will elaborate on this earlier. And just to give you a basic idea where Poplar River is and where Manitoba is, this is obviously the province of Manitoba. Up at the top, you see Canada, so you can pretty much find yourself where you are. And then the province of Manitoba and Poplar River is the big arrow that you see there from the main city within the province, which is Winnipeg. And the community of Poplar River is a flying community, which means that there's no road access into the community. I'm going to fly by through a lot of the slides because I'd like to elaborate on more things a little bit later. But just to give you a basic idea, a little bit about the community, it's a treaty reserve community, and reserve number 16, and it is on the east side of Lake Winnipeg at the mouth of Poplar River. So it's on the east side of the lake. We have 2 lakes in Manitoba, and the east side is pretty much the boreal forest. It's the archaic boreal forest of Canada, which is one of the most pristine lakes in the world. And it is on the 55 degrees latitude on the 53rd parallel, so it is pretty north up. It's north central Manitoba, but it is considered to be a northern reserve because it doesn't have any access to it, and it's a flying community except by winter roads, which are pretty much from late December, early January to February, and then by boat in the summer. So other than that, the flight to Poplar River is about an hour and a half, and it's quite expensive, especially for people living on the reserve to actually get the money and fly to Winnipeg to even do some shopping and come back. It's about $640, so it's actually quite more expensive to fly an hour and a half within the province to the community than it is to fly to England, for example. And the population is about 1,200 on the reserve and 250 off the reserve. Most of the 250 are people who are sick and have needed medical attention, and they have gone to Winnipeg. And students who actually come in to finish their school, because Poplar River currently just has an elementary school. It's the Poplar River Elementary School that goes up until, I think, middle school, approximately grade 9 or 10. So students actually leave at the age of 15 to attend high school in either the city of Winnipeg or up north to a northern reserve further up, Norway House, that has a high school. So it's quite a big issue that Poplar River is working on to establish their own school, because they're losing a lot of their youth at the age of 15 to get into cities or going, in any case, outside of the reserve. Some of the languages that are spoken are Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, Cree, and English, and I put them in that specific order because Anishinaabe is the first language that is spoken, and Saulteaux is second, Ojibwe and Cree are third, and then English is actually fourth. And you can see that pretty much everybody on the reserve is a fluent native speaker. They are, except for the generation, so kids that are approximately up to 10, 12 years old do not speak any traditional language, and that's mainly because of the generation gap and the residential school effect. So the residential school effect has created a huge generation gap because the elders speak mostly fluent traditional language, which most of them don't speak any English. Then you have the, I guess, 30-year-olds to 50-year-olds who are quite bilingual in their traditional language as well as the English, and casually speak Anishinaabe or Cree either at church or at their meetings, so that is accessible so they can communicate with the elders, but also they speak English so that the youth can understand. And then as you go down with age, obviously, the little kids don't speak the language anymore. In fact, they're trying to put the language back into school so that they will learn it. And the reserve area is of only 1,500 approximately hectares. However, the issue that I will be discussing today for you is the Park River Reserve Area, which is not a reserve, but it is the traditional territory of the Poplar River Anishinaabe, and that's approximately 700 hectares that they're trying to protect. And this is a traditional community, and they still maintain the traditional way of life, meaning that they smoke the food that they eat, they hunt, they fish, they trap, they gather, they have their ceremonies. And these are some of the pictures. I wanted to bring an array of pictures, but I thought some of them were perhaps not as enticing to most people because of the open rabbits and the skins. But these are some of the wild geese that have been caught and smoked. They're actually quite delicious. If you crack open the brain, you suck it out, it's pretty good. And then some of the other pictures of wildlife, moose meat, which is a bit blurry. So people actually still practice that way of life because one of the reasons is because it has been a remote community and it has maintained that ability to be a way of life community. However, I must point out that this is a reserve in Canada in the 21st century, like any other reserve in Canada and probably in the US. It has its social issues. Therefore, there is drugs and alcohol, violence, gangs, everything else that any, I guess, remote community or small town will have. This one does it as well. But there is a big contrast, I guess, with this community trying to protect their traditional ways and maintain to limit their the impact, I guess, of colonialism and neo-colonialism by going back and reviving those forms of culture that may have decreased over the past years, and they're trying to bring that culture back by going to healing camps over the summer for elders, kids, families, where they disappear inland for about a week and they live out that way of life where they talk about it. They have sharing circles, sentencing circles, and pretty much anything that has to do with their culture. This is where they kind of get out of the everyday present and live that way of life as they did in the past. But one way that Poplar River is trying to maintain that culture is to protect their territories. And this has been an incredibly smart move on the part of Poplar River because they are a community that has been doing this preventatively. So rather than all the issues that we've heard today, and for example in Canada with the tar sands in Alberta or grassy narrows that has a blockade for 5 years, they're still blockading that part of the forest there, as well as Sean Brandt, who's from Akwesasne, and the Mohawk territory that has been blockading and has been fined like billions of dollars to protect their territories and have gone through some kind of legal jurisdiction. This is one community that is taking a preventative act. They've seen what's happened, so they're trying to get rid of all that by maintaining a way to protect the land, no matter which means they find necessary, so they don't have to deal with a lot of the issues going through jurisdictions. And so Manitoba is a province that has its own, it works like a state. So it has its own system of management of natural resources. And this province has given the Poplar River, the little red dot is the reserve, and this is their traditional territory. It's actually 15 trapline territories that they still use and they pass down from generation to generation. And the government has protected this land, but this protection will expire at the end of this year, actually. So what is Poplar River doing with this expiry date that's coming up? Well, they pretty much have three options, is to accept the development. And they say because it's either logging from the south, mining from the north, fishing exploitation by multinational corporations from the east, or harvesting of non-natural resources from the east. So either way, there is interest in this national, I guess, pristine land that is there. And the land is one of the most beautiful landscapes that you have there. In fact, all the pictures I've included are from the national territory, except for two that I will mention a little later. And one of the proposed exploitation resource development was from Manitoba Hydro and Abitibi Weyerhaeuser or Abitibi Bowater, which is one of the biggest logging corporations. And the second option is to fight for Aboriginal title, because in the legal Canadian system, the land, like here, I guess, is held in trust, but is unceded land. They have received their territories, but the land is not recognized to be Aboriginal land. So they are fighting to have this Aboriginal territory, this Aboriginal title to this land, yet it's going to be a difficult fight because the government does not recognize any ownership of Aboriginal lands to these territories. And the third option that they have chosen to do is to accept help from international organizations. And in this case, they have chosen to deal with the United Nations. And this issue was quite big at the beginning of, I guess, the school year in 2007. So about 2 years ago, it was a huge, huge issue in Manitoba. It was a very hot topic, and overall in Canada, and included anything from local to international, private to public. and it involved a lot of the organizations here, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and mainly the issue was that Manitoba decided to have that land, that piece of land that I've shown you, as a boreal forest, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this, where Poplar River is there, this whole part of the area is the UNESCO, boreal forest. And it's one of the most pristine, untouched, undisturbed, archaic boreal forests. There's actually animals in there that have never seen a human being. There's people that live inland still that you can never find, because they're one of the people that have chosen to live life out on the land, and once they've gone, you can't find them pretty much. However, the project was also interesting and it brought attention is because that's at the same time that we had the BIPO 3 Hydro Manitoba's transmission project, which, as you can tell, the date is from 2002. So the problem with this is, I guess as some people have dealt with, the government never consults with Aboriginal people, either here or in Canada, because this project date was 2002. However, the issue of the project's actually plans, the fact that it should come out, was in 2007. So for 5 years, this project was pretty much being planned. However, there was no consultation with the First Nation or with the Canadian government, or the Canadian government probably, but not with the people, not with the public in any case. So this was pretty much a big issue because the two conflicting areas on the same territory had two different views of what is going to happen. So just to give you an idea, this is where Poplar River is, right here. And the transmission line was supposed to run 800 kilometers south up from Gillam, one of the dams up north, and to feed the growing needs of mostly United States and Northwestern Ontario. So one of the issues that I one of the reasons why I wanted to come to this conference in the US is because a lot of people in this conference are very environmentally friendly, which is great. A lot of people drive hybrid cars, save energy, and don't want to deal with such as gas or other non-renewable energy sources. However, with hybrid cars or any other form of energy, there is electricity. And electricity, mostly in the northern areas of the US or even southern areas of Canada, comes from native lands, native resources. And all of the areas up there and different areas here are the ones that have been flooded. So it is actually native lands in northern Canada or northern Manitoba or northern any of the provinces that actually feeds the energy to the United States. And if this is a call for action, well, this has to be said a little bit about the fact that Canada is pretty much giving resources away to most Americans. So it comes down pretty much to, for Poplar River, to have a transmission line that would scar the landscape, or to have a pretty much undetected, undisturbed land in northern Manitoba. Even though I guess I should mention that there was no dam planned, in the community or northern Manitoba for the transmission line yet, but this was just BIPO 3. BIPO 1 and 2 are on the other side of the lake. BIPO 3 was supposed to run through this side of the lake, which is on the east side. However, nobody ever mentioned that there has to be a BIPO 4 or 5. So there were other planning going through this community, planned to be running across from this community. However, none of it was mentioned in the talks during BIPO 3. So basically, the problem with the whole issue with Manitoba Hydro is lack of consultation on the part of the community, on the part of the companies with the community. And this is when I was flying from Poplar River. There's a comparison to these two on the right are from Poplar River. On the left is on the west side of Lake Winnipeg. So you can see the scars on the land just from the corridors. And when this issue came out about 2 years ago, there was obviously blatant racism evident in the newspapers, in overall the general public. And obviously, some of the things were contracts of the past belong to people of the past, or that Aboriginal people still deserve special status or special treatment. And there were some people who said that if you don't build the transmission line, you will continue to perpetuate the poverty of First Nations communities, because this was a development project. money was going to be pretty much brought into these communities. This was their option to get out of the poverty that they currently live in. And most of the communities on the east side, which are a little bit northern of Poplar River, are communities that only had electricity maybe for 10, 12 years. They still don't have road access. The carton, like 1 liter of milk, costs about $12 to $13. Salad, it's usually never green. It's kind of brown, and it costs about $8, $9. That's Canadian, obviously. And grapes rarely come into the community. They're usually rotten. Onions, you actually have to cut them through, and they're usually brown on the inside because it takes such a long time to get that stuff there, because you have to fly it in, and then flying in obviously costs. So a lot of people said that this project would bring in money. And with money, obviously, you'd create jobs, you'd create resources for people to actually maintain, I guess, a standard way of life that most Canadians enjoy in the South. And so when I went up to Poplar River to do my field work, this is how hard I worked. This was my breakfast every morning, pretty much. But I went up with the objectives to collect oral histories. One of the reasons I was asked to do this project is I used to collect oral histories in the province of Quebec. So this was a community that pretty much needed help in regards to battling this multinational corporation or multi-Canadian corporation, and they needed to have a way of protecting their culture, but yet keep up with the changing times. So they can't afford, as a poverty-stricken First Nation community, to hire the best lawyers, the best consultants like the government can. So they usually rely on pretty much, I guess, the benevolent actions of researchers. And I guess I'm one of them because I don't get paid for it. I'm doing this through my projects, through my master's thesis. And so they get free help there in that way because I'm the source of information for them. And I get to collect oral histories. And I give all of those histories to them as a guide, I give a copy of them to the community, plus the members who have agreed to share their oral histories. And in return, I also get to interview youth, because for this project, I wanted to interview somebody young to see what their point of view was. And another interesting thing that I wanted to find out through my project is what does development mean to a northern remote community? Obviously, many people have a different idea of development, but what does this mean for this community? And how does United Nations affect the self-determination of this site, of this Aboriginal title to land? And does it affect any of the self-government initiatives that the community plans to have? And what are the limits of the international organizations such as UNESCO? Because it is a European-based organization nonetheless, and obviously some of the policies that the United Nations have will certainly limit or implicate the self-determination of this community. And I decided to include these two pictures because during my work, one of the reasons that we're taught is, one of the reasons to work in the First Nations community is to obviously help the community itself. And what gives you the permission to work in the First Nations community up north in Northern Canada is not whether you have great methodology, if you're putting great things in, is whether the community accepts you. And you can tell if you're accepted if you can walk through a reserve and none of the dogs bark at you, pretty much. And if all the kids can scream out your name across the river, pretty much. And that's how you know you've been accepted, and that's when you officially can start working. And this is what I did. I fed the dog and the kids once, and they never went away. But this is what the proposed World Heritage Site is. It's approximately 800,000 square hectares, and it includes a collaboration of 4 different communities in northern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario, from community of Pikangikum in northwestern Ontario, Poplar River, obviously, Pongassi, Little Grand Rapids, 2 national forests, so the White Feather Forest and the Caribou Atikaki Woodland Caribou Park. And it includes the government of Manitoba and Ontario. So 2 states, 2 national parks, and 4 First Nations communities are collaborating to save this huge area of the forest, of the boreal forest, that has been untouched yet, and to save it pretty much for the next 7 generations. So actually the project the area is called Pimachawinaki, which means the earth that gives life, the land that gives life. And this is what the basis of the community's goals are, is to provide the land for the next 7 generations. And some of the positives, obviously, of the World Heritage Site is to be part of the community of World Heritage Sites, which obviously provide diversity and natural wealth. So in itself, it's a prestige. And obviously, it's a catalyst in raising awareness. There's a lot of ecotourism. People are looking for sites to see, and rarely do people are very much intrigued by the 5-star hotel somewhere in the warm countries. Now, more people are aware of their carbon footprint, so they're looking into doing something more local, or if they are, something that's ecologically stable. So they're hoping that to be put in the map, people can just either Google it or go into computer and find a World Heritage Site that they can visit, and this will hopefully be one of them. And obviously you have access to the World Heritage Fund, which is approximately $4 million US. And the World Heritage Site Committee helps working to implement the mechanisms to measure and monitor the territory so that the site can be preserved. And what does this mean for the Anishinaabe in Poplar River in particular? It means first of all, is that it's been the only site in Canada that has been nominated by Aboriginal peoples. And this is a very important part, probably in all the world, because there are World Heritage Sites, for example, in the Yukon, near the Alaska-Yukon border, there's a site that has been nominated as a World Heritage Site. However, parts of the site contradict with the Aboriginal people's traditional territories. So it's the same mechanism here that is used positively and negatively to implement or affect Aboriginal peoples. Because this one was, the one in the Yukon was culturally imposed. It was the community that said, we're going to mark off this land and nobody can touch it. It was a game preserve. That means that Aboriginal people couldn't exercise their treaty rights to hunt and fish. And here, Aboriginal peoples are themselves claiming to protect that site. So it is a very self-determining move on their behalf. And this is, since neocolonialism and colonialism, Manitoba's First Nations are collaborating together. Obviously, this has caused some dissent in other First Nations that are not involved in the project, but because of the separation and segregation into reserves, this is a great theme for these First Nations to actually work together and create this sort of Indigenous, I guess, means to protect their land. And like I said, it represents self-determination to these sovereign nations. And each of these nations believes they have full sovereignty over the lands. So this isn't like the previous speaker said, they are sovereign nations. They don't fit into the Canadian landscapes. They were there to protect their lands, to be stewards of the lands. And if you ask them where you're from, they say, we're from Poplar River, we're from Pikanjigam, we're Anishinaabe, we're not Canadian. We live in Canada now, but we're Anishinaabe first and foremost. And obviously for the First Nations community here, or all the 4 of them, will be the identification of a protected area. So it will be something that will protect the territory before any exploitation will come in to their lands. And this will be a way to protect their culture. So they will continue to have a trapping, gathering, hunting, and ceremonial ways of their culture that have done for centuries. And another thing that's interesting is it calls on the Canadian government itself to recognize, preserve, and protect. So this move on behalf of the First Nation is a move to actually have the Canadian government be responsible to live up to the expectations to actually face this First Nation, because it was their proposed site. Now they're saying, look, we've done this, now you have to answer to us. So this was very radical on behalf of this community. And in order to do that, obviously, this is a quote from one of the elders and the political advisor at the same time, who said that this is a commitment to cooperatively and collectively work with the federal government to protect the lands of the signatory treaty First Nations. Because the government has an obligation to maintain the treaty rights of these First Nations, and particularly Poplar River in this case, to protect their culture, their heritage, their traditions that they have been promised to to be protected at the sign of the treaties. And obviously the origins lie in community-based efforts that they have taken care of these lands since time immemorial. This is not by any means any sort of romanticized, native, we love the landscape kind of thing that most people seem this to be. This is more of a management of the land, meaning that we have full ownership of the land. If we want to log it, it will be on our deciding committee. They will decide what to do with it. And an important thing that could be based here is there's usually a rift between environmental groups who have supported First Nation in the beginning against this hydro development, but over time that rift has created and is made bigger, and now some environmental groups are actually not supporting the First Nation community because of the initiatives that this First Nation is planning to have. For example, they want to have ecotourism, which I will discuss a bit later, but they do want to log out a part of the land in order to place the homes. They do want to log out a part of the land to create their school. They want to continue to trap and hunt and to bring out the fur industry back. They would like to do that in order to maintain a sort of a local-based economy. But a lot of the environmentalists who are pro-animal or pro-nature and that contradict with the culture, I guess, way of life, culturally based of life for this First Nation. And therefore, some of them have decided not to join this community in their efforts. So they actually lost quite a lot of support with some of their initiatives over time. However, there is a negative aspect to this World Heritage Site, that some communities are divided once again. There are communities north of Poplar River and south who are completely against this idea, mainly because they're poor. And they say that this is something that was going to bring money into our community. Why are you sticking to the past? They think that, yes, it's great to hunt and trap, but we can still do that with a transmission line. We need money. We have no roads. Everything's expensive. We live in poverty. They barely have clean running water, and sometimes they don't. They barely get electricity except when it storms. Why do we want to perpetuate that poverty? And this has created a rift. And which brings me to the next point, is the benefits that comes with the transmission line. And obviously the creation of corridors and the running of electricity would create financial benefits. And obviously the lack of unemployment and economic opportunities. There is no employment and no economic opportunities. Sorry, there is unemployment and no economic opportunities on most reserves in northern Manitoba. People just don't have anything to do because there are no jobs. And it takes a lot of money to fly south and even get a job, to get educated. There's just, if you leave, you can't go back because you just can't make at least $640 to fly in and out of the community. It's simply impossible for somebody living on maybe $12 a month. And I do have to play a little devil's advocate in my own research, is the Manitoba Hydro that has stated that there is a rights of way they can create for animals. Mainly, they decided to say this because of all the adverse effects of the transmission line. And most people said that the transmission line is just going to be a scar in the landscape, that it's just aesthetic purpose. Animals still can go through it. There's no flooding. There is no extraction. There's no mining. There's no logging. It's just going to be a tiny corridor that you can barely see from a satellite going through this land. However, basically, that's a complete misnomer. It's a completely misunderstood issue on behalf of the companies that are promoting those ideas. And mainly because this is a new technology. It's a direct current. It's not an alternative current, which is most transmission lines are, I guess, in the south and most areas, except this is quite a new technology. There hasn't been much research done, and I won't get into the details of the effects that it could have. But in terms of employment and economic opportunities, there is none. There absolutely is none. Mainly because once the corridor is cut and made, and the transmission line is built, so yes, there could be people to cut the line and make the corridor, make up the transmission line and put up the transmission line, but after it's up, there's nothing else. I mean, you're not gonna watch the electricity go by and get paid for it. So other than maybe the next 5 years of making the transmission line the corridors and perhaps maintaining the transmission line corridors so the trees don't overgrow and knock them out, there is no jobs associated with this project at all. And another thing is that because it's a new technology, it's a direct current, obviously there's adverse health effects that are associated with this. And basically, like I said here, is the magnetic poles are altered. So obviously animal sensitivity is altered. Some birds may be directed in the wrong way because their orientation points have shifted. And I don't really want to get into that. It's just that this picture I found from the Manitoba Hydro site when they were thinking about creating this line, the transmission line way in 1995, is in their booklet. They had a little, you can see on top, a picture of a transmission line, and little kind of, it looks like a road underneath. And these were called buffer zones. And they're for animals to go across so that they can kind of cross and not get lost, which is ironic because animals don't follow roads. So it's not like they're going to have a stop sign, a green light and a red light and go underneath, because this is in the middle of nowhere, but they've created roads for these animals. And another thing is that they created them right underneath the transmission line. So in either way, these animals are going to have adverse effects to these transmission lines, so they're not going to go across the road, which is, like I said, designed just for these animals. So, and actually the graph underneath that I'd like to point out on is the effects that can be felt from the transmission line, from underneath the poles here where the electric magnetic current is passed. The adverse effects, this is the line that we're talking about. So for a person who's standing underneath, the adverse effects can be felt pretty much as far as of the land, as you can see, in about 40 meters, 60 meters. So if an animal is walking underneath these transmission lines, they will feel the effect, so they will actually avoid it up to, even at times, I've read in some of the research, up to 7 days. And another thing that's negative about the World Heritage Site is the fact that it does have policies that are quite questionable, such as the state part it states little things like insofar as possible, or the inclusion of a property of the World Heritage Site includes the consent of the state, or it makes the necessary arrangements with the government concerned. So it is very much of a nation-to-nation agreement, but the United Nations recognizes the actual nation. So it doesn't recognize the Anishinaabe people or the Papua River First Nation as a sovereign nation. So it deals with the Canadian government about what's going to happen on Anishinaabe land, which is a little bit of a concern. However, in the ultimate scale of things, perhaps it is worth it. Another thing I want to mention is that obviously Canada, I think with the US, they both have declared that they will never ever sign the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People. So there is a question here, what will keep Canada from actually maintaining any of the protocols that are outlined in the World Heritage Site in order to protect this Anishinaabe territory? And another thing that is problematic in Canada is that the World Heritage Site itself has an application by Parks Canada. Parks Canada is, I guess, kind of like the Ministry of Natural Resources, except Canadian, not just provincial. It's actually federal. And it says here in the middle, it's actually highlighted in blue, that the World Heritage Sites are administered by Parks Canada and are subject to legal requirements under the Parks Canada, and that it is them who are responsible for protection and management of wildlife and resources. So technically there's a question, who's going to manage this land? Is it going to be the First Nation, or is it going to be Parks Canada, the government funded? Because it is them who make the application for the Parks Canada for the World Heritage Site. So there is an issue here of control and management, and who is going to have more of that issue is going to be, I guess, felt with time. But it is something that Papua River is a little bit hasty of, especially since Parks Canada historically has not been friendly towards Aboriginal people at all. And I have a quote here from the community member. I was hoping to bring somebody with me, but they couldn't. And so I brought a voice with them. And this is, again, the political advisor that I quoted here. And he just sums up my entire 20-minute presentation in one sentence. He says, "We can see what happened to other communities. We don't want that. we have a resource here, and as an independent First Nation, we are interested in protecting us rather than self-sacrificing ourselves for the benefit of others. People can't tell us what to do. And when I mentioned some of these issues in my research that I had in time with in this community, and I asked them, so, I mean, all the rules I've outlined here and all the limits with this World Heritage Site here, how do you see your future? And then he said to me, it's like Canada being worried about what France is going to do. That's how much they care. Which is, I guess, a very good way to show me, and I guess most people, how sovereign they are really. However, and I guess a colonial state, it's a bit different and more complex than that. So, I guess to just summarize, I guess, and get into my conclusion, what is the option that Poplar River can have? What is a remote community up north, northern Manitoba, that is poverty-stricken, has social issues, but yet has hope for something, for a little change, to protect the land, to maintain the culture, because they believe that if their culture disappears, there will be no more Poplar River. Their culture will disappear. No more Poplar Riverians will exist. So some of the ways that they're trying to develop economically in their community, more sustainably, locally, is, I guess, through wild rice harvesting. They would like to maintain that. They would like to bring back the fur industry, as I mentioned earlier. And ecotourism is another very important and big issue that Poplar River is hoping to rely on, as well as renewable resource exploitation, such as, like I said, wild rice or branches or fur harvesting. And just a few things that I mentioned here is, for example, what some of the things that I find Poplar River is doing. They're translating the value of land, which is something that I wrote here, is because in discussing development and discussing the economic opportunities, they are translating the value of land. To them, this value of land has no monetary value. Absolutely. This is something that sustained them. It is the lungs of North America. If you don't have that, you will die. So you can't eat money. You can't hunt money. So this is a way of them to understand and to explain to, I guess, non-Indigenous people or Southern Canadians that this is how they see it. This is what they're fighting for. And this, I believe, in my research, I guess, in the more, I guess, colonial context, is a form of resistance. Them not going along with this industry here is a form of resistance against falling into this totalitarianist state, I guess, where a totalizing state of Canada is trying to assimilate this culture into this modernized 21st century culture, as they have been trying to for quite some time. And I guess, like I said in the bottom here, they are locking the future for the next generation. They're sustaining this forest is to lock a future. If all the forests in the world or in Canada are gone, they are going to sustain that forest because they are worried that if there's no food with the economy going bad, you can't buy food. If it runs out of, the store runs out of food, you have nothing to live off of. They have the land. The land has sustained them for generations and will continue to sustain them if they take care of it. And a quote I took from one of the youth people that I interviewed, and I asked him, as a youth, I mean, you have the internet, you have access to pop culture, you see through, I guess, the internet, through television, all the things that are available to you in the South, such as the money, the lifestyle of the South, and the housing, the picket fence, the cars, none of that stuff that you have. Are you against or for the development? Do you want to welcome development to have money into your community so you can buy things, you can buy your iPods or have your internet or buy the clothes? Or would you want to continue to live here? And the answer to that was basically the same for most people that I've interviewed, is that they all love the land. They admit that it's beautiful and it's worth keeping. It's just one problem, that there's nothing, and I cut out one word here, there's just nothing to do there. So they're looking for a way to maintain the land, but yet exist as a people, to develop their economy so they can continue to exist as a people. And I chose Sophia here because last year she won the North American, she was the winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize. She won $250,000 for her research. She's from Poplar River. She's one of the individuals I work with. And to her, I quoted her here, to preserve the land means preserving our people. So I decided to put her in here because she won that from the U.S. So, and just to finish off, I guess, I wanted to finish off with a quote. And this is a quote that comes from the community statement. This is on the front line of their lands management plan, is that we, as the Poplar River Anishinaabe, recognize the significance and the value of our traditional lands to the world. So it is our honor and pleasure to now share the land protection initiative with our sisters and brother in the global village. And I guess I will finish off there and leave some room for questions. I'm sorry I speak so fast, I get nervous. So anyways, if you have any questions. Any questions? Yes.
Any Indigenous people tried doing this before?
There are a few World Heritage sites that include Aboriginal people. There is the jump, head smashed in buffalo jump in Alberta, and there's a few Australian groups that have been doing this. However, to have this nominated by Aboriginal people directly, no. This is the first one.
This is pretty radical slap in the face to the government.
It is, especially because it's not something that they actually talked about. It was something that they decided to do to protect their land, and it just kind of exploded. They never expected this whole, I guess, issue to be brought to their doorstep. They never knew it was going to be such a big deal, because they said, we're just a small community. All we want to do is protect our land. We didn't think it was that big of a deal to everybody else. In fact, they didn't think that anybody would notice. That's how much that, because nobody really noticed if anybody dies there. Nobody really notices what's going on up in the northern reserves. It's just not in my backyard kind of attitude. So they never thought this was going to be such a big deal.
No, I could see where established governments would consider this to be quite a threat to their power and authority.
It was, especially since the Manitoba Hydro is a provincially supported corporation. And because they've had a plan that they just thought they would carry out at some point, this was a complete change of a plan. This was, like you said, a slap in the face, because they had to reroute the bipole. Because in the end, they have decided not to build the bipole on that side. And that only happened recently, and that's mainly because of the support that the Poplar River has received from Winnipeggers, I guess, and environmental movements or the public. So.
There was one American tribe, Southwest tribe, that took a complaint to the UN when they realized they weren't going to get anywhere with state and federal governments, and that caused quite a bit of both with the Navajo or the Hopi, but took a complaint to the UN instead of, as Indigenous people, instead of the state and federal government, and that definitely raised some eyebrows as well. But no, that's a great thing.
It is, although there's still some complications, I think, in terms of how they're going to carry out, especially mainly because there is a big difference between traditional knowledge and the scientific way that Parks Canada carries out the research. So when I said earlier that there will be implementation and carrying out of mechanisms to carry out the research in order to have this management and to preserve whose knowledge is going to be the right one, because most often than not, scientific knowledge often contradicts with traditional knowledge, especially how science is carried out and how research is carried out. So that's going to be one issue that I think Poplar River is going to be quite affected with. Yes?
This is a question, so much as a comment. It doesn't take long. I'm very interested in the various models of sustainable development. But the one that interests me the most really is what you're doing here, and I appreciate hearing about it. We want to reverse trends that we see happening on the world, global warming and corporate power and so forth. It seems rather than sustainable development, the term needs to be sustainable retreat, and that's what it appears you're doing.
Perhaps, even though the community is trying to develop in their own way, but locally. But if perhaps relying on the culture that has been considered, I guess, backwards or not progressive. That would be considered going back, but they are falling back upon those values and the knowledge that they've had as a way of preserving, I guess, or escaping the progress trap, I guess you can call it. That's a good comment. Okay, yes.
Just a comment too. I know your presentation is about the land and about the domination. What I'm curious about and what's missing for me is those people and where they live, other than the lady you showed at the end. This isn't criticism.
Mhm.
Just saying that it'd be interesting to see those people and their community, pictures of that and
Mhm.
things like that. Maybe that's a different presentation you have.
There is, but the reason I didn't want to take pictures of the people is because I try to escape from this kind of researcher interview where I snap pictures of every person I interview. The reason I got so far is because, well, she's used to it because she's the spokesperson of the whole site. So she's used to it. But the elders, they get uncomfortable with having pictures taken, and I can't take pictures of the kids unless I have their permission or the parents' permission. And the youth, they just don't care, and they don't really want to have anything to do with anything. But most people just don't want to have the pictures taken, and I didn't want to go in there as a researcher and snap pictures as if I was.
It's a paradox when you're trying to bring awareness to something that's cultural, to respect their cultural preferences and privacy. At the same time, when you're trying to bring awareness to the rest of the world, it's like people like to see people and homes and things. Otherwise, it's just a beautiful forest and lakes. It
Mhm.
can be really anywhere. So it's a paradox. I understand that.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I also don't include pictures, I think, is because most conferences I go to are not Native or Indigenous studies. So most people expect to have an image of a Native person. And if I show them an image of the people that I work with who are in jeans, baseball caps, and rubber boots, they always ask me, so how are they traditional? They wear jeans. And I don't want to keep perpetuating the idea of this community is isolated and it's a remote community and that they still live that kind of lifestyle. They're just as average, I guess, as any one of us. So that's one of the another reason that I don't do this, because most people expect that, and I'm trying not to. Yes.
One of the tools that I see that's being used though, and I didn't see you mention anything here, I'm sorry to hear the whole talk, was PKRP. You know, the traditional knowledge revival preservation that had started out in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And where they went to Queensland and they established the criteria that the people who were real knowledgeable, who were the doctors, the PhD, were the elders, not the people who were scientists who'd never been in the area, with the traditional and the oral knowledge about how the forest is established and how the wetlands work in the region, dry spells and during the rainy season. And they nominated a huge parcel of land, several thousand acres, which they said was totally undoable to bring back into Aboriginal control. And they pulled it off in 8 years. And the way that they utilized that was they went around and taught these folks, the people who lived there, how to use movie cameras and recorders. And when they went back to make the presentations to the provincial government, it said, this is what's going on here. And these are the people that know what's going on. And this is how you know that they know what's going on. So they were able to physically demonstrate the knowledge of the traditional people who lived on the land. This is kind of what you're doing right here. You're bringing a bunch of scientists or people who are going to study things, you know, based on whatever book they need. Some field, certainly some field experience, and how things should be run long term, hydrology and the ecosystems of the land. You can talk to the people that live there.
Oh.
They're the ones that know.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Like I said, I'm not sure if you were here, but there is that conflict that us, because we're aware of the Indigenous issues, we recognize traditional knowledge as a knowledge. But most scientists, I mean, they have respect for that, but they don't recognize it as a clear science.
No, we deal with that all everything.
Yeah, but most scientists don't really recognize it. Yeah, I know.
They just have a piece of
Oh, well, exactly. So that's one of the reasons, like I said, Poplar River is going to have a little problem because they do have scientists on their side, but yet that contradicts most often than not with traditional knowledge. Okay, thank you.
We're gonna-